Hey everyone, welcome back to Thursday Nas Storytime, where sleepy history turns unexpectedly spine-chilling. Today, we're traveling back to the Middle Ages, a time when justice wasn't just harsh, it was theatrical. Death wasn't quiet. It was a public event. A warning. A ritual. And trust me, it gets brutal. We're diving into some of the most unsettling execution methods ever recorded. But we're not here to glorify violence, we're here to understand how fear, power, and belief shaped entire societies. And before we go any further, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Because once you hear what passed for justice back then, you'll want to stick around for what's coming next. Let's get into it. Let's start by stepping back, way back, into a time when life was short, fragile, and often terrifying. The Middle Ages, roughly from the 5th to the 15th century, were not known for mercy or modern sensibilities. It was a world where people walked alongside death daily. Famine, disease, war, they were constant shadows. But what made that era truly distinct wasn't just how easily a life could end, it was what that ending meant. You see, death in the medieval world wasn't just a biological fact. It carried weight. Meaning. Often, it was deeply spiritual. To die wasn't merely to stop breathing, it was to pass into a new state of being. Heaven. Hell. Purgatory. Where you ended up after death was everything, and your final moments on earth, the way you died, could define that destiny. This is where public executions came into play. These weren't just punishments. They were performances, rituals, and warnings all at once. Let's say someone stole from a noble, or questioned the church, or defied the king. That wasn't just breaking a rule, it was challenging the entire fabric of the social order. And when someone did that, the response wasn't subtle. The state, and often, the church, would make a spectacle out of reminding everyone just how fragile that line between obedience and chaos really was. In modern times, justice tends to happen behind closed doors. But back then, it was meant to be seen. It had to be. Imagine a town square filled with villagers, merchants, children, farmers, standing shoulder to shoulder. The sun's high. Bells ring. A platform has been built. And then, slowly, the condemned is brought out, surrounded by guards, priests, maybe even a local noble to witness the sentence being carried out. There's silence. Maybe tension. Maybe relief, depending on who the crowd thinks deserves what. And then, the execution begins. But here's the thing, these executions weren't simply about removing a person. They were meant to teach. To terrify. To restore balance, in a way that felt cosmic. Executions in the Middle Ages were laced with religious significance. Pain was seen as purifying. Suffering was a kind of penance, and often, a public death was considered the only way to cleanse a soul before it passed on to judgment. And from the church's perspective, there was order in this. Divine order. The earthly body being punished to save the eternal soul. But for the authorities, the kings, the lords, the emerging bureaucracies, it was also deeply political. The act of execution was a display of power. A way to prove that the state was watching, and that rebellion, any threat to the status quo, would be met with force so brutal, so unforgettable, that no one would dare cross the line. What's especially eerie is how normalized this all became. For ordinary people, attending an execution wasn't some rare or horrifying experience. It was part of life. People would bring their families. Vendors would sell food. There was almost a festival atmosphere to it all. And yet, at the center of that crowd, a human being was facing unimaginable pain. It's worth asking, why did people accept it? Why cheer when someone was burned or broken or torn apart? Part of it was fear. Fear of being next. But part of it, too, was comfort. Seeing justice done, even in its harshest form, gave people a strange sense of safety. It reassured them that the world still had rules. That the king's law was intact. That the church still held sway. That good would triumph, and evil would fall, dramatically, bloodily, and in full view of everyone. And yet, even then, not everyone was comfortable with it. There were always murmurs. People questioning whether a particular execution was fair, or if the punishment truly fit the crime. There were whispers of cruelty, of excess. And over time, those whispers would grow louder. Centuries later, they'd become movements. Revolutions. Reforms. But in the thick of the Middle Ages, public execution was simply how justice was done. It's a brutal truth, but an important one. Medieval justice wasn't just about guilt or innocence. It was about spectacle. Power. Belief. A person's final breath wasn't private, it was political, spiritual, symbolic. And for everyone watching, it was a warning. A lesson. A reminder that life, order, and salvation all hung in a delicate, dangerous balance. So when we look back at these dark chapters in history, at the iron wheels, the firewood, the scaffolds and blades, it's not just gore for gore's sake. It's a reflection of how society understood itself. How it maintained control. How it tried, in its own twisted way, to make sense of chaos. And maybe, just maybe, that's what makes it so haunting. Of all the execution methods that came out of the Middle Ages, few were as infamous, or as haunting, as the breaking wheel. Now, the name might sound almost abstract at first. Breaking wheel. It doesn't immediately register as something monstrous. But when you begin to understand what it meant, what actually happened to the person at the center of it, it becomes one of the clearest examples of how pain and power were intertwined during that era. The setup was deceptively simple. A large wooden wheel, sometimes fixed in place and other times mounted on a post, stood at the center of the execution site. The condemned person, already likely battered, humiliated, and half-starved, would be brought forward, tied down, and stretched out over the wheel or a frame just beneath it. Their limbs were deliberately positioned between the thick wooden spokes, which weren't just structural, they were part of the punishment. Then came the real horror. An executioner, someone who, believe it or not, was often trained in anatomy, would take a heavy iron bar or hammer and begin smashing the prisoner's limbs. One by one. Not randomly, but systematically. The goal wasn't an instant death. Quite the opposite. Each blow was calculated, meant to shatter bones without necessarily rupturing arteries or striking vital organs. The pain was prolonged, stretched across the minutes, or hours, like a dark symphony of suffering. The legs. Then the arms. Then the ribcage. One crack at a time. Some records mention a pattern, like striking between joints, or always starting from the lower limbs and working upward. There was even a phrase for it, breaking someone on the wheel. But here's where it gets even darker. After the limbs were shattered and the victim was likely drifting in and out of consciousness, barely human in form anymore, their mangled body was sometimes threaded, almost woven, through the spokes of the wheel itself. Their limbs, now bent and broken in unnatural directions, were folded into the wood like the fibers of a human tapestry. The wheel, now holding this twisted figure, would then be hoisted up, onto a pole, a scaffold, or a crossbeam, and left for all to see. There was no attempt to hide the outcome. Quite the opposite. The display was essential. It turned the victim into a warning sign. A visual sermon about what happened when someone defied the rules, broke the law, or threatened the authority of the state or church. This wasn't just death. It was transformation, of a person into a symbol. In some versions of the punishment, the condemned wasn't killed outright. They were left alive, barely. Bones broken, body helpless, mind fading, but heart still beating. They might hang there for hours or days, slowly dying under the sun, the rain, the stares of onlookers, the pecking of birds. People would pass by and point, maybe pray, maybe spit. Children would be told, that's what happens when you lie, steal, or betray. And make no mistake, this wasn't some obscure regional custom. The breaking wheel was used across much of Europe. In France, Germany, the Netherlands. In some places, it became almost standardized, written into law. In others, it was reserved for only the most heinous of crimes: murder, treason, rebellion. Whatever the offense, the punishment was meant to be remembered, not just by the condemned, but by the entire community. There's one account that has stayed with historians for centuries. A man named Peter Stubb, sometimes called the Werewolf of Bedburg, was accused in the 16th century of sorcery, cannibalism, and worse. Whether or not those charges were real, what happened to him is terrifyingly well documented. He was placed on the wheel and had flesh torn from his body with red-hot pincers before each limb was shattered. Then he was decapitated. His body was broken, displayed, and his name passed into legend, not as a man, but as a monster who was made into an example. But even for the ordinary condemned, the wheel offered no dignity. There was no quick death, no quiet exit. It was violence made into ritual. Pain made into performance. The executioner, in a way, was not just killing the body, he was dismantling it, piece by piece, until what remained barely resembled a person. And then that image was lifted high, for the world to see. It's hard to imagine that level of cruelty being normalized. But in its own context, the breaking wheel made sense. It delivered the kind of message that rulers and religious authorities wanted to send: disobedience brings not only death, but obliteration. Not only punishment, but public shame. The soul might go to judgment, but the body would serve as a lasting monument to suffering. And yet, the longer you sit with it, the more unsettling it becomes. Not just because of the physical pain involved, but because of how deliberately it was constructed. There was an art to it. A procedure. A kind of cold logic. It was designed to make people afraid, not just of crime, but of stepping out of line in any way. In some cases, the public even demanded it. Crowds would gather, hoping not just for justice, but for spectacle. They wanted to see guilt punished in a way that felt thorough, even righteous. They believed, or wanted to believe, that the wheel cleansed the land of evil. Of course, we now see it differently. We see a violation of dignity. A loss of humanity. We wonder how anyone could endure such a thing, and how others could cheer it on. And yet, the breaking wheel did more than destroy bodies, it revealed what society feared most. Disorder. Defiance. Collapse. And it showed just how far people were willing to go to hold the world together, even if that meant tearing someone else apart. As brutal as it was, the breaking wheel wasn't just a method of death, it was a message. And for hundreds of years, it spoke loudly. Painfully. Relentlessly. And for those who witnessed it, the image of that wheel, blood-stained, towering, turning slowly in the wind, wasn't something easily forgotten. If the breaking wheel was about crushing the body, then burning at the stake was about purifying the soul, or so people believed. There's something ancient and deeply symbolic about fire. It can destroy, of course, but it also cleanses. It lights the way, reveals the hidden, consumes the impure. In medieval Europe, fire wasn't just a force of nature, it was a tool of God. And when it came to public execution, it was the preferred method for punishing those who were considered spiritually corrupt. Burning at the stake became the go-to punishment for heretics and witches, anyone accused of defying religious doctrine or consorting with the devil. In a time when the church held near absolute power over how people lived, prayed, and even thought, being labeled a heretic wasn't just dangerous. It was a death sentence. And not just any death. A death in full view of your neighbors, your friends, and sometimes, your own family. The ritual often began days before the actual burning. The accused, usually someone who had been imprisoned for weeks or months, would be dragged into a public square. Their clothes might be stripped, or replaced with a rough sackcloth, a symbol of their shame. A priest would walk beside them, sometimes offering a final chance at confession. And even if they confessed, the punishment often stayed the same. Fire would have the last word. A wooden stake, tall and solid, stood waiting. Around its base, dry kindling and firewood were piled high. Rope or iron chains held the condemned in place. Some were fastened so tightly they couldn't move at all. Others were loosely bound, allowed to raise their arms or cry out, because part of the point was to let the crowd hear their final words. Whatever happened next wasn't supposed to be private. It was supposed to be witnessed. And then, someone would light the flame. At first, it would start small. A flicker. Smoke curling into the sky. Then the fire would grow, crackling louder, climbing upward, licking at cloth and skin. The screams, if they came, cut through the noise like a bell. People in the crowd might cheer, or weep, or simply stare in silence. Children watched. Nobles watched. Priests watched. Everyone was meant to take something from it. In the eyes of the church, this wasn't just punishment. It was redemption. Fire, they believed, didn't just burn flesh, it burned sin. Especially when the accused was a woman. In medieval thought, women were seen as more susceptible to temptation, more vulnerable to the whispers of evil. A woman who stepped out of her role, who spoke out, who healed without permission or worshipped differently, she was seen not as brave, but dangerous. That's why so many of the victims were women. One of the most famous, perhaps the most tragic, was a 19-year-old girl named Joan of Arc. You've probably heard her name, but her story is worth revisiting, because it captures just how blurred the lines were between faith, fear, and fire. Joan was a peasant girl from France who claimed to hear the voice of God. Not only did she listen, she acted. She led troops into battle, inspired soldiers, and helped turn the tide of the 100 Years' War. She dressed in men's armor, carried a banner instead of a sword, and became a symbol of divine hope for her country. But eventually, she was captured. Put on trial by the English. Accused of heresy. The charge? Wearing men's clothing. Speaking to angels without church approval. Claiming direct communication with God. That was enough. On May 30, 1431, Joan was tied to a stake in the marketplace of Rouen. She asked for a cross, which someone gave her. Witnesses said she prayed as the fire was lit. As the flames rose, she cried out the name of Jesus. And when it was over, only ashes remained. But here's the twist: 25 years later, the church officially declared her innocent. She was made a saint. Her execution was reclassified as a mistake. That's how quickly the winds of justice could change. Burning at the stake wasn't just about the person tied to the post. It was about reinforcing the authority of the church and the moral framework it laid out. It was about keeping society clean by eliminating those seen as spiritually infectious. The fire didn't just consume, it cauterized the wound they believed heresy left behind. It's worth noting that not all burnings were equally deadly. Some were merciful. That's in heavy quotation marks. In a few rare cases, a prisoner might be strangled before the fire reached them. Other times, gunpowder bags were tied to their waist to create a quick, explosive end. But most of the time, there was no such grace. People burned alive. Slowly. The crackling of the flames, the twisting of the body, the smell of smoke and charred flesh, it all became part of the theater. The crowd might flinch. Or cheer. Or stay frozen. But the message always landed, and it lingers, even now. Burning at the stake ended, not suddenly, but gradually, as societies began to question the cruelty of their justice. By the 1700s and 1800s, Enlightenment thinking began to shift attitudes. Human dignity, legal fairness, individual rights, those ideas took root, and the fire began to die out. But the memory of it remains. It lives on in literature, in superstition, in our collective imagination. We're still haunted by it, not just because it was brutal, but because it was once seen as righteous. Necessary. Holy. That's the part that makes it so chilling. We look back and wonder how people could justify such horror in the name of salvation. But the truth is, when belief and fear intertwine, it becomes frighteningly easy to convince ourselves that pain is purification. That fire can fix what we fear, and that's a lesson we're still learning. In medieval England, there was one crime that stood above all others, a crime so serious, so deeply offensive to the very idea of order and loyalty, that its punishment had to match its magnitude. That crime was treason. And the punishment for treason was drawing and quartering. Now, if you've ever heard that phrase tossed around in history class or maybe in an old movie, you might know it's bad. But chances are, you've never really sat with what it meant, what it looked like. Because this wasn't just execution. This was annihilation. The sentence was reserved for men only, at least in its full, gruesome form, because society at the time believed women should be spared such public indecency. If a woman committed treason, she would usually be burned instead. Which, as we've already seen, wasn't exactly merciful. But drawing and quartering? That was something else entirely. Let's walk through it. First, the condemned man was drawn. That didn't mean sketching a portrait, it meant being tied behind a horse or a team of horses and dragged through the muddy, filthy streets of the city. His arms bound, his body bouncing and scraping against the cobblestones, he'd be hauled from the prison all the way to the place of execution, usually the public square. This was meant to humiliate him. To reduce him to less than a man before the punishment even began. Once there, the real horror unfolded. He was hanged, but not to death. The executioner was careful to let him hang just long enough to bring him close to the edge. His body would twist, convulse, his face would turn purple, but before death could take him, he was cut down, still alive. Barely. Then came the second act, disembowelment. While still conscious, at least in many accounts, the condemned was laid out on a wooden block or scaffold. His abdomen was sliced open. The executioner reached inside and began removing his intestines, his stomach, his bowels, sometimes slowly, deliberately, so the crowd could see. These organs were often burned right there in front of him, a symbolic cleansing of his traitorous insides. All of this was meant to strip the traitor not just of life, but of identity, of dignity, of any shred of humanity. If he wasn't dead by then, and many were, it didn't matter. The execution would go on. Next came the beheading. The head was severed from the body with a knife or axe and held up for the crowd to see. A kind of twisted trophy. Sometimes the executioner would shout a phrase like, "Behold the head of a traitor," as he raised it high. But even that wasn't the end. The man's body, already broken and bloodied, was then chopped into 4 parts. Usually the arms and legs. These quarters, as they were called, were sent out across the kingdom and displayed on spikes or hung from gates in major towns and cities. His head might be placed on London Bridge or a castle wall. Each piece was a message, broadcast in flesh and bone: this is what happens when you betray the king. Drawing and quartering wasn't just about killing. It was about erasing. Dismantling. It turned the human body into a symbol of failure, of rebellion crushed under the weight of the crown. It made the very idea of dissent feel dangerous, not just for the one who dared it, but for everyone who might be watching and thinking the same thing. And people did watch. In droves, crowds would gather for these executions. They'd cheer. Gasp. Cover their mouths in horror. Parents brought their children, either out of morbid curiosity or to use it as a lesson. This is what happens when you disobey. This is the price of disloyalty. But here's something that's easy to miss: the punishment wasn't just about physical destruction. It was about political destruction, too. See, in the medieval mindset, especially in England, the king wasn't just a ruler, he was the embodiment of the state. To commit treason was to attack not just a person, but a sacred order. A divinely ordained system. And so, the traitor's body, his very form, became a kind of political body. To cut it up was to destroy that symbol of defiance. To scatter the pieces was to show that rebellion had no place to hide. This idea of the body politic wasn't just metaphor. It was taken very seriously. The traitor's body was made an example of, so his disloyalty couldn't inspire others. His limbs, once capable of acting against the crown, were nailed up as warnings. His head, once filled with rebellious thoughts, was now lifeless, rotting in the open air. And maybe the most chilling part. All of this was done with ceremony. With legal precision. With the backing of law, church, and crown. It was, in their eyes, not barbarism, but justice. Justified. Deserved. Some of the most famous victims of this punishment were men who dared to speak out against tyranny. William Wallace, the Scottish freedom fighter immortalized in Braveheart, was drawn and quartered in 1305. Thomas Armstrong, a supporter of King James II, met the same fate in 1684. Each name now remembered not just for how they died, but for what their deaths were supposed to mean. Eventually, of course, the punishment was phased out. By the 19th century, England had moved toward more humane forms of execution. The world was changing. Ideas about justice were shifting. But for hundreds of years, drawing and quartering served a clear, terrifying purpose. It didn't just end a life. It obliterated a legacy. And for those who watched it happen, or who passed under the city gates and saw a severed leg swinging from a hook, the message was clear: loyalty wasn't just expected. It was mandatory. The crown didn't forgive. The king didn't forget. And the consequences were carved, quite literally, into the history of the realm. Far to the north, beyond the reach of kings and castles, in a colder, wilder corner of medieval Europe, the Vikings had their own way of dealing with enemies. Their punishments, like their lives, were forged in legend, war, and firelight. And among all the stories of Viking wrath and retribution, one stands out for its sheer brutality, so shocking that some historians still argue whether it really happened at all. They called it the Blood Eagle. Now, the name alone sounds like something torn from myth. And maybe that's exactly what it is. The truth is, no one knows for certain whether this ritual was ever carried out. But the fact that it was believed to have happened, and described in such vivid, terrifying detail, says a lot about how the Vikings understood pain, honor, and sacrifice. So what was the Blood Eagle? According to the sagas and scattered historical texts, it was an execution meant not just to kill, but to send a message. The victim, usually a captured enemy or traitor, was laid face down. Then, in one of the most gruesome procedures imaginable, his back was sliced open along the spine. One by one, the ribs were broken near the spine and pulled outward, flaring open like wings. The lungs were then drawn through the opening, draped over the ribcage to resemble the outstretched wings of a bird, an eagle, to be exact. Hence the name, Blood Eagle. The victim, it said, had to remain alive, at least for a while, through the process. Because pain was part of the point. The Blood Eagle wasn't just an execution. It was a ritual. A performance. A kind of offering. And in the Viking worldview, that offering was for Odin. Odin, the god of war, death, wisdom, and poetry, was not a gentle god. He demanded sacrifice. He valued bravery. To the Vikings, honoring Odin meant facing death without fear, and sometimes, inflicting it with purpose. The Blood Eagle, in this context, was a sacred act, a symbolic transformation of the enemy into a gift for the gods. But it wasn't for just anyone. You didn't Blood Eagle a petty thief or a poor farmer. This was reserved for the most worthy of enemies. Kings. Warriors. Betrayers of blood. Men whose deaths needed to mean more than silence. And while some say the ritual was rare, others believe it may have been mythologized precisely because of its shocking power. And here's the thing, whether it happened exactly as described or not, people believed it did. They feared it. And maybe that fear was the whole point. Imagine you're a rival chieftain or a rebellious noble taken prisoner after battle. You know execution is coming. But not a sword to the neck. Not a quick arrow to the heart. No, you're told you're being given a special fate. A death so epic, so cruel, that it will echo into eternity. You won't just die. You'll become a symbol. A warning. A sacrifice. The terror of the blood eagle wasn't only physical. It was spiritual. In Norse culture, how you died mattered. Dying with honor meant everything. To die screaming in agony, your lungs pulled from your back as your own body was turned into an altar, that was something different entirely. It wasn't just a punishment, it was a kind of erasure. A way to break not just the body, but the legacy. Still, for all its horror, some sources hint that enduring the blood eagle without screaming, without begging, might have been seen as the ultimate act of defiance. A way to take control of your death even as your body was being destroyed. That quiet resistance would have earned respect, even from your executioners. But let's come back to the question, did it really happen? Some scholars argue that the stories were misread, that poetic metaphors from Old Norse texts were taken too literally. Maybe, spreading the ribs like wings, was meant symbolically. Maybe the eagle wasn't a shape, but a reference to birds feeding on the corpse. There's a case to be made for all of that. And yet, the fact remains, the blood eagle stayed alive in the imagination for centuries. In the sagas, in Christian writings that condemned it, in the whispered stories of warriors sitting around fires. Whether fact or fiction, it had weight. And that tells us something powerful. It tells us that the Vikings understood punishment as something more than justice. It was theater. It was religion. It was a way to reinforce the rules that mattered most to them: loyalty, courage, strength, and sacrifice. We often romanticize the Vikings today. Picture them as wild seafarers, explorers, raiders with horned helmets and boats slicing through mist. But in truth, their world was built on hard choices and harsh codes. And the blood eagle, real or not, fit into that world perfectly. Because in the end, the power of the ritual wasn't just in what it did to the body. It was in what it said to everyone else. You cross us, and you don't just die. You become something else. A spectacle. A sacrifice. A warning carved in flesh and remembered in blood. And whether or not anyone actually experienced the blood eagle, the fear it inspired was real. That, perhaps, was its greatest weapon. Now, if Europe had its wheels, its fires, its quarterings and legends of blood-soaked wings, then ancient China had a punishment that was no less terrifying, no less deliberate, and perhaps even more psychologically devastating. It was called Ling Chi. Often translated as death by 1,000 cuts. But this wasn't just a phrase. It was a method. An ordeal. And for those who suffered it, it was the slow, painful unmaking of the human body, piece by piece. Ling Chi wasn't used lightly. This was no everyday punishment. It was reserved for what were considered the gravest offenses in the Confucian moral universe: treason, parricide, the murder of one's master or sovereign. In a society where order, hierarchy, and filial piety were pillars of life, crimes that disrupted those foundations weren't just wrong, they were dangerous. They threatened the harmony of everything. And so, the punishment had to reflect that gravity. It had to be unforgettable. The condemned would be brought out, often into a public square. Stripped to the waist. Tied to a wooden frame. There was no grand stage, no flaming pyre, no horses dragging them down a road. Just a man, restrained and exposed, and the executioner standing close by, holding a blade no larger than a paring knife. And then it began. The first cuts were often small. A sliver of flesh from the chest. A slice from the arm. The idea was not to kill quickly. In fact, the early incisions were designed to avoid major arteries. The executioner, trained and experienced, knew exactly where to cut to keep the victim alive. And aware. That awareness, that consciousness, was part of the punishment. Because this wasn't just a physical death. This was symbolic destruction. Every cut severed more than skin. It chipped away at the body's integrity, its completeness. In Confucian thought, the human body was a sacred gift from one's parents. To die whole was to honor your lineage. To die dismembered, in pieces, that was something else entirely. It wasn't just pain. It was disgrace. Not only in life, but in the afterlife as well, the execution could stretch on for hours. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, of cuts. Flesh was peeled from the torso, then the limbs. In some documented cases, muscle was carved away in long, deliberate strokes. The cheeks sliced. The nose removed. Sometimes, the hands and feet were severed late into the ordeal. And all the while, the crowd watched. Quiet. Or maybe murmuring prayers. Or maybe just trying not to look too long. Eventually, after what felt like forever, the final cut would come. A thrust to the heart. A mercy. Of sorts, but even then, the punishment didn't end. The dismembered body would often be displayed. The parts arranged for public viewing. Not for horror's sake alone, but to complete the message, this person did not die with honor. This person broke the sacred bonds of society. And this is what becomes of someone who does that. There was a spiritual layer, too. In traditional Chinese belief, the soul's peace after death was connected to the body's integrity. To destroy that body was to tamper with that soul's journey. It was believed that a soul whose body had been desecrated might wander. Might suffer. Might never truly find rest. So Ling Chi wasn't just meant to destroy the person, it was meant to deny them dignity forever. And perhaps that's what made it so chilling. Not just the slow pain. But the idea that the pain followed you. Beyond death. Into eternity. Ling Chi was outlawed in the early 20th century. The last known executions by this method happened during the final years of the Qing dynasty. And when it ended, it didn't go quietly. It became a symbol in itself, of cruelty, of imperial decay, of justice gone too far. Photographs of one such execution, taken by a French soldier and later circulated in the West, shocked audiences. They became evidence of Eastern barbarity in the eyes of colonial powers, though, ironically, these same nations had practiced their own brutal forms of execution just a century earlier. But let's not mistake horror for fascination. Studying Ling Chi doesn't mean glorifying it. It means recognizing the extremes to which societies will go to defend their values, enforce their structures, and preserve their ideas of order. In ancient China, maintaining harmony was everything. But when that harmony was broken, when someone betrayed their father, their ruler, their nation, the response wasn't just personal. It was cosmic. It had to echo beyond the crime. It had to undo the person completely. And so, death by 1,000 cuts became not just punishment, but purification. Not just destruction, but ritual. Looking back on it now, we can't help but recoil. It feels inhuman. Excessive. Unimaginable. But that's the power of it. That's why it was used. To scare. To warn. To make absolutely certain that no one else would ever commit the same offense. In the end, Ling Chi wasn't about the knife. It was about the message. A message carved into the flesh, one slice at a time. And whether you believe in the afterlife or not, it's hard to shake the feeling that something deeper than the body was being cut apart on that scaffold. Not every execution needed a blade or fire. Some were quieter, slower. More patient. In England, there was a method of punishment that didn't require public spectacle or elaborate ceremony. It required only a flat surface, a wooden board, and time. They called it pressing. Technically, the full term was peine forte et dure, strong and hard punishment, but most just knew it as pressing under stones. And it was exactly what it sounded like. The condemned would be forced to lie down, flat on their back, often with their hands and legs stretched out and pinned. A heavy wooden board, usually something rough-hewn and thick, was placed over their chest. Then, slowly, deliberately, stones were added. Not all at once. That would be too quick. The goal wasn't to kill instantly. It was to encourage confession. You see, pressing wasn't always used as punishment after a conviction. More often, it was used before. If someone refused to plead, refused to say guilty or not guilty, the court couldn't proceed. And in cases where the legal system hit that wall, this was their way around it. Stone by stone, the pressure would increase. The board would sag. Ribs would creak. Breathing would become shallow, then painful. Bones cracked. Blood vessels burst. But the person beneath that weight had one way out: speak. Enter a plea. Confess. But not everyone did. Some chose to remain silent. Not because they had nothing to say, but because of what saying something would cost them. Under English law at the time, a person who refused to plead couldn't be convicted, and therefore, their land and possessions couldn't be legally seized. That meant their family, wife, children, or next of kin, could still inherit what they left behind. And so, some people made a terrible choice. A final act of defiance, not for themselves, but for the people they loved. Perhaps the most haunting example is that of Giles Corey. It was 1692. Salem, Massachusetts. The infamous witch trials were sweeping through the town like wildfire. Hysteria hung thick in the air. Accusations were traded like currency, and anyone could become a suspect. Giles Corey was in his 70s, a farmer, tough, stubborn, known in town. When his wife, Martha, was accused of witchcraft, Giles found himself under suspicion too. He was arrested, and authorities demanded a plea. Guilty or not guilty? But Giles Corey didn't answer. He knew what would happen if he did. A plea meant a trial. And a trial could lead to a conviction. And a conviction meant that everything he owned would be forfeited to the state. Not a single acre of land or a barrel of grain would pass to his children. It would all vanish into the chaos of the court. So he said nothing. They tried to break him. They brought out the board. They laid him on the cold ground, placed it across his chest, and began to add the stones. One. Then another. Then another. The weight grew heavier by the hour. According to witnesses, he never cried out. He never begged. And then, on the third day, as the sheriff leaned in and asked once more for a plea, Giles Corey said only 2 words: more weight. And with that, he died. That moment, the silence, the crushing, the resistance, has lived on in American history ever since. It wasn't just an execution. It was a statement. A refusal to bend, even as the stones piled up and the world closed in. But Giles Corey wasn't the only one to face the press. In England, the practice had existed for centuries, particularly in cases where property, honor, or religious allegiance was at stake. And while most victims eventually gave in, the very existence of pressing reveals something troubling about justice at the time. It wasn't always about proof. It wasn't always about right or wrong. Sometimes, it was simply about control. Forcing the hand. Crushing the spirit until it broke. Physically, the experience was agonizing. As the weight increased, the chest would collapse inward. Breathing became a shallow gasp. Blood vessels in the eyes would burst. The skin would bruise and split. And eventually, the heart, compressed under the immense pressure, would stop beating. Death by pressing could take hours. even days. And the slowness was part of the design. It gave the accused time to consider their options, to wrestle with the consequences. Speak, and perhaps live. Or remain silent, and die slowly, but with a kind of integrity that not even death could steal. It's a strange kind of bravery, isn't it? The choice to stay silent not because you're afraid, but because you're not. Because you care more about what happens after you're gone than about how you leave this world. In the years that followed, pressing was eventually outlawed. Seen as too cruel, too archaic. But it left its mark, both in the law books and in the imagination. The idea that justice could press the life out of you, quite literally, in the name of order and obedience, it lingers. Today, we might talk about pressure in a different way. The weight of guilt. The burden of proof. But back then, pressure had a form. It had mass. It had the cold edge of stone. And for those who faced it, justice wasn't swift or clean. It was heavy, crushing. If there's one thread running through all these methods of execution, from the burning stake to the breaking wheel, from 1,000 cuts to a single crushing stone, it's this: none of it happened in the shadows. Medieval execution was not meant to be hidden. It was meant to be seen. These weren't just punishments. They were performances. Imagine the town square on the morning of an execution. Bells ringing. Market stalls paused. Children on tiptoe. The scent of smoke or iron in the air. Crowds pressing in, eager, curious, uneasy. This wasn't something you stumbled upon, it was something you went to. Something you talked about. Something you remembered. Because executions in the Middle Ages weren't just about death. They were about spectacle. A carefully staged ritual where every scream, every drop of blood, and every last breath carried meaning, religious, political, moral. Pain wasn't incidental. Pain was the message. The condemned weren't always criminals in the modern sense. Sometimes, they were dissenters. Heretics. Enemies of the state or the church. What mattered most wasn't always what they did, but what they represented. And so, their deaths had to tell a story. One that would be impossible to ignore. That's why executioners weren't amateurs. They were trained. Skilled. Professionals in every sense of the word. They knew anatomy. They understood the body, not to save it, but to break it efficiently, publicly, and, if necessary, slowly. The goal wasn't just to kill. It was to maintain awareness. To draw out the agony. Because the longer the condemned stayed conscious, the more the crowd could absorb the lesson. These men knew where to cut to avoid major arteries. They knew how to fracture bones without delivering fatal blows too soon. They could gauge exactly how much pain a body could take before it shut down. And they used that knowledge with terrifying precision. They were part surgeon, part torturer, part stagehand, but even they didn't act alone. Public executions were communal affairs. They were scripted, sometimes choreographed down to the minute. The church played a role, offering last rites or demanding confessions. The state played its part, issuing decrees, building the scaffold, ensuring order. And the people, the crowd, were not passive. They came to watch, to shout, to weep, to cheer, or to stand frozen in place. Because watching someone die like that did something to you. It didn't just scare you. It shaped you. You saw what happened to those who defied the law. Who questioned the crown. Who dared to whisper beliefs that weren't approved. And you carried that image with you, back to your home, your hearth, your family. You warned your children. You reminded your neighbors. It's not hard to see why rulers relied so heavily on public executions. They were the medieval version of state media. A brutal form of public relations. Every breaking body said, "This is power." Every final cry said, "Obey." Every display of a severed limb or head on a spike whispered, "Don't even think about it." And the crowd got the message. Not just through fear, but through something more complex. Because, believe it or not every onlooker was horrified. Some felt vindicated. Some felt righteous. They believed justice was being served, God's justice, the king's justice, their justice. They weren't just watching a death. They were watching order being restored, but there was also a strange intimacy to it all. Unlike modern execution chambers, quiet, clinical, hidden behind thick walls, these punishments unfolded just feet away. You could see the sweat. The struggle. The raw panic. You could hear it. Feel it, and as disturbing as that sounds, it was the whole point, because what better way to remind people what was at stake? What better way to turn one person's fate into a living, bleeding cautionary tale? Even the language surrounding execution reinforced its theatrical nature. They didn't just carry out a sentence. They staged it. They didn't just kill, they displayed. The act itself was half justice, half drama, and like any performance, it needed a moral. The moral was clear, the body belonged to the state. To God. To the law. And if you betrayed that trust, if you broke the rules, you forfeited not just your life, but your flesh, your dignity, your soul. In many ways, these executions were public sacrifices. Offered not just to the divine, but to the idea of civilization itself. Order. Hierarchy. Stability. They didn't need every person in the crowd to cheer. They just needed them to watch. And they did, because once you'd seen someone stretched on the wheel, their limbs broken one by one, once you'd heard a man gasp for air under a growing pile of stones, once you'd stood shoulder to shoulder with your neighbors, staring up at a scorched body tied to a stake, once you'd seen all that, you didn't forget it. That memory lived with you. And it made you think twice before speaking out. Before resisting. Before stepping out of line. That's why these executions worked. Not because they were fair. Not because they were right. But because they were unforgettable. For all the blood, for all the screaming, for all the public terror, medieval executions weren't just about punishment. They weren't even just about fear. At their core, they were designed to restore something bigger than one person, one crime, or one town. They were about order. In the eyes of many who lived during the Middle Ages, the world was held together by a delicate balance, between heaven and earth, good and evil, right and wrong. It was a moral structure reinforced by religion, tradition, and law. And when someone broke that balance, when someone sinned, rebelled, or betrayed, they weren't just defying authority. They were tearing a hole in the fabric of the universe. So what did the people do? They gathered. They watched. And when the condemned took their final breath, whether through fire, stone, blade, or rope, they believed something had been fixed. The balance had been restored. Justice, in all its painful, brutal glory, had been served. And in a strange, unsettling way, that brought comfort. Because life in the Middle Ages wasn't easy. Not even close. Disease was common. War never felt far away. Famine struck hard and fast. Most people didn't live past their 30s or 40s, and even if they did, life was full of uncertainty. They couldn't control much, not the weather, not their crops, not even their safety. But what they could cling to was justice, or at least, the idea of it. They believed in a cosmic order where wrongs would be punished and rights rewarded. And executions, for all their violence, felt like a reminder that someone was still keeping score. For the onlookers, it wasn't always horror they felt. Sometimes, it was satisfaction. Even joy. Seeing a known criminal, especially one who had harmed others, suffer publicly could stir a deep sense of moral approval. They might clutch their children tighter. Whisper prayers. Or simply stand and watch, feeling reassured that the world still made some kind of sense. That evil did not go unanswered. That chaos could still be brought under control. There was a strange duality in the crowd. People recoiled at the violence. But they also leaned in. They winced. But they looked. Because what they were witnessing wasn't just punishment, it was symbolic. The pain meant something. It was cleansing, in its way. It told a story. A story where good eventually triumphed. Where the wicked met their end. In religious terms, executions often mirrored biblical justice. Fire represented purification. Blood was tied to sacrifice. Pain, to penance. And in many cases, the condemned were given one final chance to confess, to accept their sins, and make peace with God. If they did, the crowd could rest a little easier. If they didn't, well, the flames or the blade would finish what the priests could not. To us, it might seem absurd. Barbaric. The idea that watching someone be torn apart could bring peace or reassurance feels almost impossible to relate to. But for those living in a world ruled by fate, sin, and divine judgment, it was logical. Even necessary, and sometimes, that sense of reassurance ran even deeper. Because when the condemned were people of status, traitors, heretics, noble rebels, their executions reminded the public that no one was above the law. That even those in power could fall. That there was still accountability, however cruel. And in a society built on hierarchy, that idea had real power. Executions, then, were not just ends. They were resets. They marked the line between chaos and order. Between threat and stability. The death of the criminal became a kind of ritual offering to the greater good, and for a time, at least, people believed the world was right again. It's important to note that this emotional response wasn't born from malice alone. Yes, there were those who delighted in cruelty. But for many, the reaction was more complicated. It was rooted in fear. In the need to believe that good still held the upper hand. That the darkness creeping through their villages, through their borders, through their own doubts, could be beaten back. And when they saw that punishment carried out, when they saw a witch burn, a traitor torn, a murderer broken, they could go home that night feeling safer. Not because the danger was gone, but because someone had faced it. Justice, in the medieval mind, was never about comfort. It was about certainty. And executions, public, dramatic, unforgettable, offered that certainty in the most tangible way possible. Of course, the truth was far messier. Many of those condemned were innocent. Many were scapegoats. Victims of fear, of politics, of religion gone too far. But to the crowd, watching from the edge of the square, it was simpler. The bad were punished. The good remained. The system worked, even if it was built on blood. So when we look back today and try to understand how people could watch such horrors and still sleep at night, we have to remember, they didn't see horror alone. They saw order. They saw justice. Twisted, yes. Cruel, often. But to them, it was real. And in a world where death was always near, where chaos was always a whisper away, sometimes that illusion was enough. Enough to keep believing. Enough to keep obeying. Enough to feel, just for a moment, that the world was still under control. By the time the 18th and 19th centuries rolled around, something had begun to shift. The public squares that once echoed with screams and sermons were quieting. The towering gallows, the smoldering stakes, the groaning wheels, they were starting to disappear. Not overnight, of course. But slowly, steadily, one country after another began to pull back from the spectacle of execution. It wasn't just the instruments of punishment that were changing. It was the philosophy behind them. Ideas like human rights and dignity were entering the conversation. Thinkers, writers, and reformers began to question not only how people were punished, but why. Was the goal truly justice, or was it control? Was the pain necessary, or had it become tradition for tradition's sake? Suddenly, the image of a man torn apart in front of cheering crowds didn't seem righteous anymore. It seemed monstrous. Barbaric. Out of place in a world that was beginning to believe that even the worst among us still deserved to be treated with a sliver of mercy. The state didn't lose its power, but it changed the way it expressed it. Execution moved behind closed doors. Punishment shifted toward imprisonment. The goal, at least in theory, became rehabilitation, not retribution. And though capital punishment still lingers in many parts of the world today, the ritualized cruelty of medieval justice belongs largely to the past. And yet, when we look back at these brutal methods, the wheel, the flames, the cuts, the stones, we see more than just violence. We see a reflection of fear, of order, of human nature at its most exposed, because these executions didn't happen in a vacuum. They were shaped by the world that created them, a world where religion was law, where rulers were seen as divine, where obedience was survival. A world where pain was not just tolerated, but orchestrated. Where crowds gathered not only to witness justice but to feel safer, more certain, more connected to something bigger than themselves. What's haunting is how effective it was. How pain became policy. How fear kept people in line. And how, time and again, entire societies convinced themselves that cruelty was necessary for peace. There's something deeply human in that impulse, the urge to protect order by punishing chaos, to make an example out of those who step out of line. But history shows us what happens when that impulse goes unchecked. When the desire for justice loses sight of compassion, because once you remove empathy from the equation, justice stops being justice. It becomes theater. Spectacle. A tool of control dressed up as righteousness. And that's the part we can't afford to forget. We like to believe we've evolved past the wheel and the flame, and in many ways, we have. But the truth is, the line between civilization and cruelty is thinner than we think. It doesn't take much, a crisis, a war, a wave of fear, for people to start looking for scapegoats again. To justify harshness in the name of order. To cheer at the downfall of someone deemed other. We've seen it happen. In every era. In every culture. That's why these old methods still capture our imagination, not because we enjoy the gore, but because they reveal so much about the societies that use them. They show us how justice, without conscience, can become a weapon. How rituals meant to bring peace can spread terror. How entire nations can stand and watch, believing they're doing the right thing, while someone dies screaming before them. It's a disturbing legacy. But it's also a powerful lesson, because if we want to build something better, if we want a justice system that truly honors fairness, humanity, and accountability, then we have to remember where we've been. Not to dwell in shame, but to understand. To recognize how easy it is to turn pain into policy. To acknowledge the cost of forgetting compassion. The executioner's blade may be gone, but the instincts that forged it still live in us. And so, when we look back on these punishments, let's do more than wince. Let's ask the harder questions. About power. About fear. About the price we're willing to pay for control. Let's remember Giles Corey, crushed under stones for refusing to speak. Joan of Arc, burned not for what she did, but for what she believed. The unknown thousands who were flayed, broken, quartered, not because they were monsters, but because they challenged someone else's idea of order. Their stories are not just history. They're warnings. In the end, justice must always be stronger than vengeance. And our ability to show mercy, even when it's hardest, may be the only thing separating us from the darker chapters of our past. So yes, the executions have ended. The blood has dried. The wheels have stopped turning, but the questions remain, and they're ours to answer. At this point, you might find yourself asking a simple but unsettling question. Why do we watch this? Why do we lean in when we hear about these ancient, brutal punishments, the burning, the breaking, the cutting? Why do we click the titles, read the stories, imagine the pain? And why, after all this time, do we still feel drawn to the darkest chapters of our past? It's not because we enjoy cruelty. At least, not in the way the medieval crowds might have. Most of us are horrified by the details. We cringe. We shake our heads. We wonder how anyone could do such things to another human being. But we also keep listening. Keep reading. Keep wondering. There's something magnetic about it. Something we can't quite turn away from. Maybe it's because these stories reveal a side of history that feels more honest than the clean, polished narratives we're often given. They show the mess. The fear. The rage. The raw struggle for power. There's no sugarcoating in a torture chamber. No ambiguity in a public burning. These moments, as awful as they are, strip history down to its bare bones. And sometimes, that brutal clarity is exactly what we're looking for. Maybe we're drawn to them because they remind us how far we've come. When we read about the drawing and quartering of traitors, or the 1,000 cuts of Ling Chi, it's almost impossible not to feel a surge of gratitude, for laws, for rights, for protections we now take for granted. These stories give us contrast. They throw the present into sharper relief. We look at them and think, thank God we're not still doing that. But that's only part of it. There's another reason these stories stay with us. A deeper one. One that makes us uncomfortable, even as we admit it. We're drawn to these executions because they expose how fragile civilization really is. When you read about the crowd cheering as a man is burned alive, or the methodical way bones were shattered on the wheel, you start to realize something. All the structures we think of as normal, justice, fairness, empathy, are not permanent. They are choices. Cultural decisions. They can be built up, and they can be taken away. Violence, fear, and spectacle, those are much easier to fall back on. And history shows us that it doesn't take much. A plague. A war. A charismatic leader. A lie repeated often enough. When people are afraid, they start reaching for control. And one of the oldest tools for control is public punishment. The performance of pain. That's what makes these old methods so relevant even today. They may seem distant, tucked away in dusty books and stone castles, but the forces behind them are very much alive. Fear. Anger. The hunger for power. The desire to make someone pay. We may no longer tie people to wheels or burn them in the square. But the instinct to dehumanize, to shame, to humiliate in front of a crowd, it hasn't disappeared. It's just changed form. Now, the square is digital. The crowd is online. The punishment isn't physical, but emotional, social, reputational. Still, the logic behind it is eerily similar. Someone broke the rules, so we gather to watch. We judge. We condemn. And we call it justice. That's why the fascination lingers. Because in some strange way, these ancient stories help us understand ourselves. They hold up a mirror, not just to our ancestors, but to our own time. Our own systems. Our own reactions to fear and power and pain. And they whisper something quietly, insistently. This could happen again, not in the exact same way, maybe. Not with iron wheels or ritual sacrifices. But the idea, that pain can be useful, that fear can be productive, that some people deserve to suffer for the sake of the many, that idea is still dangerously easy to revive. So we study it. We watch the old punishments unfold again, not because we celebrate them, but because we need to understand them. We need to remember how quickly violence can become ritual. How easily justice can turn into spectacle. How fast a crowd can forget the difference between punishment and cruelty. Because the truth is, civilization is a delicate thing. The rules we live by are only as strong as our willingness to uphold them. And when we forget the past, when we stop seeing where the path of fear and pain leads, we're far more likely to walk down it again. And that, more than anything, is why we keep returning to these stories. Not out of bloodlust, but out of curiosity. Not out of morbid fascination, but out of caution. Because buried beneath the horror is a warning. A reminder that what we call progress is not guaranteed. That justice without compassion is still injustice. That a society which loses sight of empathy will, sooner or later, reach for the torch, or the blade, or the stone. So we keep looking back, not to glorify, but to guard against forgetting. And maybe that's the most human instinct of all. If tonight's story gave you chills and kept you curious, let me know what you thought in the comments below. I'd love to hear your take. And if you want more strange, haunting chapters from history to drift off to, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Thursday Nas Storytime. It's the best way to support the channel and help us keep unearthing the darker side of the past. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Sleep well, and try not to dream about the breaking wheel.
Dàn tới đây luôn á. Lấy máy là quay gửi cho anh Thịnh. Thì chớp chớp nhán nhán được rồi. dàn Thịnh.
Quay nó có đỏ đâu, không quay có đỏ. Không có đỏ. Nói xì kìa chứ nói này quay đâu.
Thì chớp chớp nhán